Hello. We're going to have some fun this week. We're going to take our white balance photos that we took and create a collage of warped photos with Photoshop to demonstrate what we learned about white balance this week. The first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure that you've got a folder that has your white balance photos. You can see that I've carefully named my photos with the different white balance selection I used. So daylight, shade, cloudy, flash, white fluorescent. I have two subjects in my folder right now, my skeleton and the tree outside of I1. For this assignment, I'm going to go ahead and use the skeleton. I think it does a good job of demonstrating the different colors that the white balance filters create, and we'll get started with that. The next thing I'm going to do once I've got everything organized is I'm going to open up Photoshop. So make sure you open up Adobe Photoshop CS6. And we're going to start by creating our master Photoshop document. So to do that, I'm just going to go to File, New, and I'm going to create my, I'm just going to call this Chris Rubin White Balance Final. And so this is going to be my final white balance document that I'll be working with. And you can see that I've set it to be 29 inches wide, 6 inches tall, and 300 pixels per inch. And my reasoning for that is I'm going to have 4 images that are going to be 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall. So if you multiply 6 times 4, that's going to be 24 inches. And that'll give me a little extra space on each side to lay my photos in. So let's start. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to select OK, and I've got my master Photoshop document. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open the first picture that I want to edit. So for that one, it's going to be my skeleton daylight. You can see I numbered them. And in a new tab, it's going to open up my skeleton daylight. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to resize our image. So I'm going to go to image size. And you can see this is a huge image, 72 inches wide and 48 inches tall. So like I just said, we want to change that. We're going to set it to be 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall. And I'm going to change my resolution to 300 pixels per inch. I'm going to select OK. And it's going to get a bit smaller. If you want to make it bigger so it's easier to see what you're working with, just hold down Control on your keyboard and push the plus sign 1 or 2 times. All right. And the fun thing is today, like I said, we're going to create this collage of warped photos. So what we're going to do first is we're going to warp this photo, and then you're going to repeat that for each of the 4 photos that you're going to use. And the other fun thing that we're going to do today is, in addition to learning how to do that, you're going to learn a couple of really important keyboard shortcuts. So again, we open the first photo that we're going to work with, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rename our background layer. All right, and that's because this layer, as you can see right now, is locked. So we'll be able to make adjustments to it if we rename it. So double click on it, and the new layer name will come up. It's going to be called layer 0. That's fine. And go ahead and select OK. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new blank layer below layer 0. So to do that, I can go scroll to the very bottom of my Photoshop document where it says Create New Layer. I'll click the button, and my layer 1 will pop up. But like I said, we want this new layer below layer 0. So I'm just going to click and drag, and now I've got it down there below layer 0. The next thing I need to do is I need to add some additional canvas space. So that's what I'm going to use this layer for, because I want to make some adjustments. When we warp it and when we add some shadows, we're going to need a little extra space. But to do this, it's really easy. All we have to do is we're going to go up to that image tools again. And this time we're going to go to canvas size. And instead of choosing it by inches, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose it by percent. And instead of it being right now, it's 100%, the canvas size, the image fills the whole thing. We're going to make the canvas size 150%. That's going to make it so that it's a slightly larger on the top, bottom, left, and right. And here's what that's going to look like when I'm done with it. I'm going to go back there really quickly, go to image, canvas size, and it is really important to make sure that you have not checked the relative box, right? That'll give you a result you don't want. So go ahead and hit OK again. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a white stroke to our image. Okay, that's going to go around the exterior of our image. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on the layer 0. Click on layer 0 where our image is. We're going to go to edit. We're going to go down to stroke. And we're going to choose a width for our stroke that's going to go around it. So you'll get an opportunity to see here. I'm going to set mine to 20 to start. And I'm going to change my color to white. So again, you can see I just clicked on my color palette. And I'm going to drag it up here to the top left. It's going to be white. I'm going to set the location to inside and make sure my blending mode is normal at 100% opacity. I'm going to select OK, and you can see I just got this white stroke around my image. If that's not as wide as you'd like, you can always go back to stroke, edit stroke, and you can increase that, right, to, for example, 30 pixels. And so I'll leave it there for now. The next thing we're going to do, now we're going to get to some fun stuff. We're going to warp our photo. So to do that, we can do one of two things. To get to the warp tool, we can either go to edit, transform, and select warp, right? In which case it'll bring up our warp tool right away, right? Or I can hold down Control T on my keyboard, which will bring up the transform tool, and then up here at the very top, here's my warp tool. I can select that. So either of those ways is fine, however you want to get to the warp tool. And you'll see that with the warp tool, you'll see a 3x3 grid come over your image, okay? All you have to do is you can use all of these little handles on the top and bottom corners, or any of these connecting lines in the middle, these dots on the side, and we can pull and push them to create a look that we want. One of my favorite things with the warp tool is to be able to take this bottom right corner, right, and I can actually curl it back, right, so that we can see the back of the photo appearing in the corner. That's kind of a neat feature, right? And then I can pull it, again, this is just kind of playful, right? We can kind of push and pull and stretch until we have a result that we're happy with. The more you play around with this feature, right, the more comfortable you'll be with it. So again, I encourage you just to spend a couple of minutes and play around with it. You can always pause the video if that gives you like a little bit more time to do that. Once you're done, right, we want to apply the changes. So when I'm done with this, I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter, and you'll see that my warp tool will disappear, and we're ready to move on. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my layer 0, and I'm going to duplicate that layer. To do that, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say duplicate layer, right? It's going to be named layer 0 copy, which is fine with me right now. Right? Another way to do that is just to hit select Control J on your keyboard. That's a nice quick shortcut. Click back on your original layer 0. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a background for our image. So we've got our main image now is actually going to be on layer 0 copy, and on layer 0 what we want to do is we're going to fill the original image with black. Okay? So to do this, we want to just start by pushing the letter D. So don't hold down anything, just push the letter D on your keyboard. If you watch over here, I've got my foreground and background colors. When I click D, it resets to its original setting with black as my foreground color and white as my background color. All right. The next thing I'm going to do is on layer 0, I'm going to fill the image on the layer with black. Okay. To do this, I'm going to show you another shortcut. You hold down on your keyboard Shift, Alt, and then push backspace. that makes it so that my layer 0 just filled with black. We're going to use this to create a drop shadow effect. Okay, so once again, we're going to use the warp tool. So to do that, remember, I'm going to hold down Control and press T. And I'm going to go up and grab my warp tool. And what I'm going to be able to do now is if I pull out, I'm going to be able to create this shadow outside of my image. Now remember, it doesn't have to look, we're not going for absolute realism here. So you can push and pull like however you'd like. You can make it look a little bit bigger than it normally would. But the idea is that we don't want the black coming out everywhere. We want to look like the light is hitting it from the top left of the photo and then carrying it all the way through. All right, so there we go. So I've created that, that drop shadow. I'm going to just click on Enter or on the green check mark at the top to set my preferences. And we're going to try and make this look a little bit more realistic. So to make it look more realistic, we're going to go up to our filter menu at the top. We're still selected on layer 0. We're going to go to blur and we're going to select Gaussian blur. Okay. When you do that, we're going to get this this little toolbox is going to pop up, and you can set your radius as high or as low as you'd like. So if you look right here, if I set it to 6 pixels, right, you can see that it gets fuzzy around the side. Let's see what happens if I set it to 20 pixels. It gets a little bit fuzzier, right, and starts to blur a little bit more. So for me, like I might choose something in between. I might choose 14. You can choose anything, maybe as low as 6 or as high as 20. When you're happy with your result, just go ahead and hit OK. And obviously, if you had the preview button clicked, then you'd see what it does each time you change it. I'm also going to change the opacity of this layer because I don't need to see that I don't need to see like that drop shadow incredibly dark. So to lower the opacity, just right here in my toolbar, I can drag this down. I'm going to set the opacity to 60%. And now it's starting to look like kind of a natural shadow. Like my image is coming off the page a little bit. It's really warping and curling. And I've got that drop shadow showing up nicely. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to click layer 0, copy, and I'm going to add a new blank layer above the other layers. So for that, I'm going to grab a new layer. I'm going to click it. It's going to pop up as layer 2. Okay, and on this layer, I'm going to start to add some highlights. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the blend mode of my new layer to hard light. So right here, I can change the blend mode from normal to hard light. And I'm going to change my opacity this time. I'm going to lower it to 20%. So instead of using the sliding scale this time, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click in here, highlight, and change it to 20%. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and click on we need to select our layer 0 copy and add a selection around the image. So to do that, before you do anything, just go ahead and hold down Control and click just on the thumbnail. And you can see what that did is it loaded a selection on our image in the document window. Okay, so it didn't switch our layer. We're still working on layer 2, but it did load a selection on here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my brush tool. And I'm going to go up to the tools here at the top. And I'm going to change my master diameter. I'm going to actually make it a bit smaller. I'm going to change it to about, doesn't need to be perfect, but let's just go with 250 for right now. Okay, and you have a lot of different brushes, but for this assignment, you don't really need to change it. and we're just going to simply paint over some parts of the image to add some shadows. So again, you can sort of see what it's going to do. See how it's just very subtle right there. So you got to think about, where would I have shadows on my image? And the answer would be, like, if the light's coming from up here, right, there'd be like a slight shadow underneath his armpit, right? Maybe like one right underneath his, and if I click it a couple times, you can see it's getting slightly darker each time. I'm not going to play around with that too much because I don't want to darken my image and undo what we're demonstrating with our white balance. The other thing you can do if you want is you can switch your foreground and background colors by just clicking X on your keyboard. I'm going to click X, watch what happens here. And now if I wanted to, I could paint some highlights, right? So you can see how it's lightening up right there, or even up here at the top. If you want those to show up more or less, you're always welcome to change the opacity of that layer. And you can see how they show up a lot more. This is kind of what I did. I added these like black and white dots essentially with my brush tool, right? But by keeping the opacity layer level low, at like 20%, they're very subtle, which is nice. Okay, so here's my image, right? I'm happy with it. Shadows and highlights are added. And so my last thing that I need to do is I need to group my 3 layers right here, layers 2, layer 0 copy, and layer 0. And I'm going to put them, and I'm going to group them together. Okay, so to do that, we're going to simply, layer 2 is already selected, hold down the shift key, click on layer 0, and layer 0 copy. Right, so I've got those 3. So again, I hold down the shift key and I can click on each of those. With all 3 layers selected, we can go up to the layer menu at the top, layer, and select group layers. And it'll put them all into one group. Okay? You can always like double click this and you can rename it. In this case, this is my daylight skeleton. So I might just want to put daylight skeleton. All right, and there's my first image. Okay, I'm going to now repeat that a few times so that I have each of my images warped, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to add them all to my white balance document. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pause this video, and I'm going to come back. No. All right, so I've gone ahead and I created a warped photo for each of the 4 skeleton photos that I took, demonstrating different white balance. I've got my skeleton with my white balance shade setting. I got my skeleton with my white balance cloudy setting. I've got a skeleton with my white balance tungsten setting. And lastly, I've got my white balance daylight setting. So now I'm ready to assemble all of these to my final document. All right, and I just want to throw in a couple of reminders as you create each of these. I walked you through one. As you create each one, when you open the image, please make sure to resize it, right? You can resize your image by just going to image size. This is the first thing you should do. And you're going to change it to 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall. It'll eventually get a little bit bigger because of the extra screen area that you're setting and so on and so forth. All right, so how do we get it all into our final document? All right, we're going to go back to a step that we learned in very first week 1. We're going to go to Window, Arrange, and we're going to say Float All in Windows. That's going to make it so that I can see all of all of my different screens and each of the different Photoshop documents that I created. I also want to make sure that I've saved each of my documents. So I'm just going to go through quickly and make sure that each of them is saved as a Photoshop document. File save. And this is just going to make sure if anything were to happen, my computer came unplugged, froze, anything, I haven't lost my work. So let's go ahead and start with the shade setting, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on that Photoshop document where I've grouped my layers. All I have to do is that folder, I'm literally just going to drag it onto my main document. It's that simple, right? You can move and position it wherever you'd like it. We'll start with that for right now. All right, and then essentially I'm done with the shade one, right? Because I already imported that onto my main document, so I can close that window. Now I've got my cloudy, right? So I'm going to take that folder and I'm going to drag this one on. All right, and we'll just go ahead and we'll set them up pretty close to here, right? I'm done with that. My next one's my tungsten, so I'm going to, again, don't grab the photo, grab the folder and drag the folder on. We've got that guy right there. And one last image. This will be my daylight skeleton. And we'll get him on there now. So now that I've got them all on, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to go back to Window, Arrange, and consolidate all the tabs. It's going to make it a lot easier to view my final document. And as you can see, my spacing is actually all right. I'm just going to highlight all of my images, or my folders in this case. I'm going to drag them all over so that we can see them. You can see now why we created our document as wide as we did. And then one by one, if I want, I can just set them exactly where I'd like them to be. I'm happy with that guy. But my daylight one, I want to be a bit higher. I'm actually going to move him in a little bit. There we go. So the next thing I need to do is I need to make sure that my audience knows what kind of white balance setting I'm working with. So for that, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to grab my text tool. And these last couple finishing steps are very easy. Let's go ahead and add a new layer. We're going to call this my text layer. Oops. Grab my text tool. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to type in all caps white balance. And this one is my shade setting. It's jumping off the page on me, so I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to drag it back on. Okay. And as you know, I like just I like the idea of just sort of copying. Sorry, let's just go copy. Not cooperating with me, that's all right. We'll just grab my text tool again. And this one we know is going to be our cloudy skeleton. So I'm just going to go white balance, cloudy setting. Just put that right underneath. This one is my white balance tungsten setting. And then one more. I've got my white balance daylight. And it'd be nice, they're all on the same layer, so it's easy to adjust my text. Actually, let's just go ahead and, oops, no, they're not. Set this a little bit lower. Set that a little bit lower. Go to my cloudy setting. Set that a little bit lower. And then one more. Move that down right there in the center. So that's looking pretty good. And the last thing I really want to do is I want to add a background, just sort of like brighten it up a little bit. So to do that, I can simply go to my folder. Right over here, I minimized my screen slightly. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to drag, oops, let's actually create a new layer right here. And then I'm just going to drag this on so it's in the background. We're just going to enlarge it so it goes the whole width of our, I got a really nice large image, even though it looks like it's going to be blurry. And I position it, it won't be. I've got some leaves in the background, right? And then you can always adjust it so that your text looks as good as possible. And there we go. I've got, oops, let's make sure that it's end to end. And there we go. I'm in a file. Make sure I've saved this. And then we'll come back to it to submit it. Don't forget, you've got to go to File, Save for Web. Make sure your settings are correct. 4 up, JPEG high. And then remember, you're going to change your larger setting to 600. And then make sure you have a good name for it. And that'll save it so that you can submit it as a JPEG file. Thanks for your attention. Hopefully that was helpful. And I look forward to seeing your final